Hope you're doing all right. Hope you're keeping safe, and I hope you're keeping sane. Thank you to everyone who left some positive and indeed negative feedback on my last video. It was done in a bit of a different style, which actually I think this video is going to be done in as well. A bit more of just a sort of a discussion, sort of introspective look at my experiences and my advice, if we can call it that comes off the back of those experiences. So once again, let me know what you think. What I do want to talk about today is reducing your level of gambling, cutting back on your gambling, whether it's something you should do, whether it's something that you can do, and if you want to do that, what steps you can take in order to actually reduce the amount you are gambling. Now, this video actually comes off the back of a question that one of my friends asked me, who actually messaged me to say, I think I'm spending a bit too much time gambling. In fact, actually he's starting to find it a little bit boring at times. Have you got any advice on ways in which that I can cut down? In essence, this video is a response to that, but it's not the first time I've been asked the question, and also it's a very interesting one and something that I wish I could have found a response to when I first started looking at my gambling habits, or good number of years ago. So what I want to do is look in two parts really. Firstly, whether you should cut down on your gambling, and secondly, if you are going to, how to sort of go about that really, and what the measures you can take are. So should you cut down on your gambling? Now, the very, very quick answer to this is, if you are asking this question, then I would suggest that you don't need me to tell you the answer. If you find that you are gambling too much, either in terms of the money you spend, so the financial impact, whether you're talking about how much time you're spending gambling, whatever form that gambling might take, but also if you're finding, you're questioning whether you should cut down because it's causing some sort of problems in your life, be that problems with friends, family, in relationships, or problems relating to both time or money that is being spent on gambling. If you are questioning it, then I believe the answer, of course, is yes. Gambling is something that you need to address. It is from my experience in life, and there may be occasions where this isn't the case, but if you reach a point where you're questioning a potentially harmful behaviour, and whether or not you are spending an excessive amount of either time or money or other resource on said behaviour, by the time you get to the point of questioning it, then the chances are you already know that this is a potential problem, if not a problem already. But I would take probably this sort of principle one step further and say, if you're thinking you should cut down, then there's a very, very good chance that you should probably stop altogether. Now, this is where I have to give my normal disclaimer and say that in no way am I being preachy here. I'm not saying that you must do, it's all black and white and you must do no gambling at all, if you gamble to any level, of course. But the very fact that you're questioning yourself and watching this video, it puts you in the position that I was in sort of 3 or 4 years ago, when I was looking at ways of sort of limiting and sort of cutting down the amount I was gambling, and which ultimately, I'll be honest, I had no success in doing, for reasons I'm going to sort of come on to discuss. Gambling is an addiction, as we know, and if we look outside of our own sphere of gambling and our attitudes and our behaviours around gambling, and we look at any other addictive either substance or behaviour, we would suggest that cutting down is not really an option. I mean, you wouldn't suggest, for example, to an alcoholic that, okay, well, you're not used to having 15 pints a day, so why not just have 4? Because we know, not even from experience, but we just know from sort of common consensus and common knowledge, that that's not an effective way to address a problem of that sort. As gamblers, we think, or I certainly thought initially, that I would like to cut down my gambling. And the reason I decided I wanted to cut down my gambling was not because I wanted to prevent the damage that it was invariably going to cause me, it's actually the reason I told myself I wanted to cut down my gambling is because I wanted to gamble. Now, if that sounds counterintuitive, think of it this way. I had already acknowledged, by asking this very question, I had already acknowledged to myself that I had a problem. I was asking myself, should I cut down my gambling? So I knew, either sort of circumstantially because it was causing me problems, or I knew that I was on the road to causing myself problems because of my behaviour around gambling. So I asked myself the question, should I cut down my gambling? And of course, but the answer from my gambling brain was a resounding yes. Yes, Phil, do it. Restrict your gambling. Make sure you're only gambling a small amount, or spending a small amount of time gambling each day or each week or each month or whatever. But the reason I was doing that is because I had to address it, and the alternative was, of course, abstinence, was, of course, quitting gambling completely and becoming the way I am now, which is in recovery. By suggesting to myself that I could reduce my level of gambling, by suggesting to myself that I could limit it, and maybe just have a gamble at the weekends, maybe just have a bet on the footy, maybe just have the odd £50 here or there on the online slots, I was allowing myself to continue gambling while satisfying this inherent need that I had identified to do something about it, to do something about the problem that I had caused myself. And I, at that time, wasn't ready to quit. I've spoken before that when you go into gambling recovery, you have to, yes, there's always going to be a need to address the problem. And that's quite often the most, the initial sign, the initial symptom of an addiction is we see a need, be that a financial need because there's too much month left at the end of the money, or we see a need because we identify an impact that our behaviour is having on those around us. And that's one box ticked, but the most important box that we need to tick is that we have to want to change. We have to want to do this to get into recovery, to be abstinent in order for our recovery to become ultimately a success. Need alone is not enough in most cases to be the basis of a successful recovery. So when I first identified this need, I didn't want to quit. I knew I needed to. I knew I needed to address the problem because I could see, from my bank statements, from the ever increasing financial hole I was getting myself in, and also from the amount of time I was spending, damage to relationships, social things I had to sort of cancel either because of the money or because I was too busy gambling or wasn't in the mindset to socialise. There was a need, but I didn't want to quit. I still wanted to keep that drawer ajar. So I convinced myself that I would just limit, the frequency and the extent to which I gambled. I was that alcoholic that's telling myself that I could drink on weekends or at birthdays and weddings and all the rest of it, because I didn't want to stop. But then when I wanted to stop, then that's when I went one step further. But I've spoken about abstinence and quitting entirely in so many videos. Obviously, this I want to really focus on cutting down. And cutting down gambling as someone with an addiction, or at least the seeds of an addiction, is, in my experience, far, far more difficult in practical terms than abstinence altogether. I've said before, and again, this isn't coming from a position of a high horse. I've said before that certainly during lockdown, there was really no excuse to gamble if you had sort of outwardly expressed both a need and a want to quit. Options for gambling were incredibly limited during lockdown. It was really online gambling, or maybe things like scratch cards or whatever, but primarily it was online gambling. So if you were saying, I need to stop, I want to stop, but you were still finding a way, then I would suggest that maybe you hadn't reached that point at which you were ready. Because all you need to do to completely quit gambling online is to install GamStop, self-exclude, block gambling transactions on your cards. It's never actually, whilst it's never been easier to gamble, since the explosion of 24/7 online gambling, it's also never really been easier to abstain from it. Now, of course, I will accept there are exceptions to this rule, and there will always be a way to sort of get back into gambling if you try hard enough and if you spend enough sort of time and effort, finding a way to gamble. Then yes, you'll nearly always find a way. But for 99 point whatever % of the time, there are effective ways to manage a recovery. If, however, you want to limit the amount that you are gambling in financial terms or terms of time or whatever, it's actually much harder to execute in a practical way, because there are no sort of watertight limit blocks, if you know what I mean. There are, on individual gambling sites, of course, loads of ways you can restrict your time or expenditure or turnover or deposit limits, spin limits, whatever you want to put. Every, as far as I'm aware, every reputable licensed online casino or online bookies has these facilities in place to restrict your time, restrict your expenditure, your turnover, your wins and losses, whatever. But if without putting the blanket bans in place, there will always be another casino to sign up to, another place where you have these blocks. Let's face it, if you've got a £50 limit, but you've got a £50 limit of 50 accounts, then the whole limit becomes an irrelevance, because you can still lose £2,500 in my hypothetical example. But depending on your own personal and financial limits, you can still cause yourself excessive harm should the gambling urge take hold. And I would suggest, of course, that if you're gambling to any level, even it be a relatively low and affordable level, then the urge is much more likely to take hold. And certainly you encourage the repeat betting, you encourage the loss chasing and all the other problems that basically symptomise a gambling addict in the first place. So when someone says, should I restrict my gambling? Yes. If you want to limit the harm that gambling is doing to you and to limit, your risk of addiction, of course, anything you can do to reduce, your partaking in a dangerous and addictive pastime or substance behaviour is a positive. But actually putting practical measures in place to restrict yourself that don't require willpower is incredibly hard. Restriction requires willpower. You can take away your ability to gamble with quite a few steps, but cast iron, blocks and restrictions and all the rest of it I've talked about many times before. But putting a plan in place to limit your own exposure to gambling and limit your own expenditure, both in financial and in terms of time, requires both willpower and inherent planning and monitoring and budgeting and all the rest of it. And addiction is not, addiction is not something that we can really kind of balance. It's not something that we can negotiate with. We can't tell our addicted brain that yes, it can have a little bit of a hit at the weekend, but the rest of the week it can't, because you're placating that addiction, and keeping it alive. And don't get me wrong, if you put sufficient blocks in place to stop yourself gambling altogether, that demon doesn't go away. The addiction doesn't go away. You don't immediately stop having urges. I will say time and time again, they become less frequent and less severe over a good period of time, but they don't disappear overnight. The only thing that disappears overnight is the ability to act on them. And every time you act on one of those urges, the time between having strong frequent urges and having weaker, less frequent urges gets longer. So I would say if you're watching this video now and you're thinking I want to cut down, the same position I was in a few years ago where I was telling myself I wanted to cut down my gambling. What I was really telling myself, and consider if this is you, what I was really telling myself is I don't want to stop gambling, because I knew that I had to do something, and the alternative to cutting down was something that in my head at the time was so monumental, was so unfathomable. The idea of a life without gambling, an idea of a life without a bet on the football, or the idea of a life without a quick punt on the fruit machine in the pub or whatever, it seemed, incomprehensible. So what was my option? Well, my option was to, draw up a plan. I'll give myself X amount to bet. I'll limit myself on all my accounts and all of this sort of stuff. And really, what was I doing? I was that alcoholic just trying to have 2 cans of lager a night. I was, I don't know, that heroin addict just jacking up once a week. I don't know. I mean, thankfully that's one of the few addictions I've never actually been susceptible to. But you can see my point. We can't really negotiate with addiction. And if you've got to the point where you're questioning your behaviour, the chances are, if you're not in full addiction already, you are certainly susceptible. And my recommendation from learned and difficult and damaging experience is you're certainly better to sort of act on those suspicions and act on that sort of self-questioning sooner rather than later, because the earlier you deal with it, the less of a hole you're likely to dig yourself in sort of financial terms and other gambling related problems, which we've discussed many times before. It would be remiss of me to suggest that the earlier you address it, the easier it is to quit, because you can continue on at the same level of addiction for years and years, and it doesn't necessarily make the addiction worse. It just makes the fallout and the ultimately the damage caused worse. So just saying, it's easier to quit because you've only been gambling for 6 months would be remiss, and actually would be belittling the power of the addiction. So whatever stage you're at, if you are questioning whether you're gambling too much and you're thinking, I should probably be gambling less, then my advice would be based purely on my own destructive experience, would be you probably need to think about stopping altogether. But as always, I will say, look, everyone's recovery, everyone's life is different. You have to live your life in a way that you're comfortable, and if you're not ready to quit, then maybe do look at ways in which you can restrict yourself, and maybe get someone to monitor your expenditure. So whereas I always suggest to people who are abstaining that they hand all their finances over to someone else, if you want to cut down on your gambling, maybe do a sort of a variation on that, where you only have access to X amount for gambling, or have a separate bank account that isn't blocked from gambling transactions, and just use that as your gambling fund. Please don't take any of this as actual advice, because it's very much contradictory to what I truly believe, but I also respect that we're not all in the same position, and that often doing something is better than doing nothing. And sometimes trying to limit yourself, again, in my experience, limiting myself highlighted the fact that I couldn't limit myself. It was as simple as that I couldn't stop once I'd started. And this came in all sorts of forms, from actually doing what I've just spoken about, which is setting an agenda, setting a limit, setting kind of like a plan, and then failing at that plan, to simple willpower exercises such as, I'm just going to have a quick 50 quid, without any other sort of blocks in place or anything, and then that 50 quid turning into another, into a huge brain out session. So that's my advice. That's actually, more importantly, my experience. It was something, if I'm honest, I was told time and time again, online, in person, but also that I read, that I didn't want to believe, because it didn't fall in line with this vision I had of gambling normally, being someone who could have a tenner's worth of footy bets, or could just have a tenner in the fruit machine or whatever. It didn't fall in line, so I disregarded it and clung on to the, albeit true, statement that everyone's recovery is different, and thought, well, mine will be different. Mine will be going from excessive gambler to moderate gambler, rather than from addict to, sober, recovery, all of those terms, which I still use but hesitate to use, because I don't like this notion that someone in recovery, someone who is being successful in abstinence, is still addict. They're still, ill. But I know that whilst I might not class myself as an addict, I know that I would very easily fall back into addiction if I was to restart those negative behaviours. Hope that helps. Hope this was interesting. Like I say, people seem to sort of react quite well to these. This is kind of a very honest sort of video. This is me just talking as me. It means the video is probably twice as long because I and ah and say like and more and right and all these sort of things multiple times while I'm thinking. But hopefully it does relate a bit more. Yeah, as always, thanks for watching. Stay safe, stay sane, and I'll speak to you all soon. Have a good week.